Margaret had always envisioned her life to be peaceful, steady, and uncomplicated. For a considerable time, it had been precisely that. She resided alone in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by small gardens and the gentle murmur of distant streets. Her days were predictable, sometimes solitary, but comfortable. Yet when she adopted Thomas, a boy with inquisitive eyes and a reserved smile, everything transformed. Before I unfold the rest of this night, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really does help more than you know, and if you're drawn into stories like this, I want you here for every one of them. Also tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in a small town where the evenings fall slow and gentle, or in a city where the lights never quite go dark? He brought vitality into her home, laughter into her days, a sense of purpose she had never experienced. Watching him develop from a quiet, uncertain child into a thoughtful, independent teenager filled her with pride. She loved him intensely, a love that was tender yet heavy with responsibility. Thomas, for his part, had grown close to Margaret. He valued her kindness, the way she listened without judgment, the small rituals she had established around their home. Margaret had always attempted to balance guidance with affection, ensuring he felt secure yet respected. He possessed a natural intelligence, a gentle humor, a way of making Margaret laugh even on her most difficult days. Over the years, the bond they constructed seemed unbreakable, as if they were the only two people who truly understood each other in the world. Margaret often caught herself observing him, thinking how swiftly time had passed, wondering how the boy who once grasped her hand now stood tall before her with his own thoughts and convictions. But as Thomas entered his late teens, Margaret noticed subtle changes. He started spending more time alone in his room, brushing past her quickly, offering only polite nods instead of the enthusiastic smiles he once gave. Conversations that had once flowed freely now seemed guarded. She couldn't identify when it had begun, but there was a distance in his eyes, a hesitation that made her heart constrict. She worried, wondering if she had done something wrong or if he simply needed space to mature. Margaret loved him, but she also wanted him to understand her, to connect with her, not just as a parent, but as someone who shared deeper customs and experiences. 2. One rainy evening, as the sky darkened and droplets tapped gently against the glass, Margaret decided to speak. She brewed tea, poured it carefully into 2 cups, sat across from Thomas at the small wooden table in the kitchen. The room carried the scent of warm spices, comforting and familiar, a small world where only they existed for a moment. She stirred her tea slowly, watching him sip quietly, then took a deep breath. "I thought we could do something meaningful this weekend," she began softly, her voice carrying a blend of hope and nervousness. "Just the 2 of us, something I've always dreamed of sharing with my son." Thomas's hand froze mid-sip. He looked down at the table, tracing the pattern of the wood with his finger. I don't think I can do that, Margaret," he said finally. His voice was calm, polite, but the refusal struck her harder than she anticipated. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had known this might happen. Thomas was maturing, developing his own identity, learning where his boundaries lay. She understood logically that he had the right to decline, but emotionally, it hurt more than she expected. Margaret felt a strange blend of disappointment and longing. She didn't want to pressure him, yet a part of her wondered what would happen if she didn't at least attempt to reach him. She leaned back, her mind racing. She remembered the early days of their life together, the way he had clung to her after his first night in her care, the shy but bright smile when he finally called her mom. Every memory reminded her of the depth of their bond, and every memory made her fear losing it now that he was testing boundaries. Margaret realized this wasn't merely about the customs she wanted to share. It was about connection, trust, the hope that Thomas would perceive her intentions as loving rather than controlling. "I understand," she said finally, forcing warmth into her voice. "I know it might feel unusual or uncomfortable. I hope one day you'll see why it matters to me. But I won't force you, I just wanted to ask." Thomas nodded, still looking down, and Margaret could see the conflict in his expression. He respected her. He cared for her. But he wasn't ready. In that moment, she realized that love wasn't just about what you wanted to share. It was about honoring the other person's choices, even when it hurt. After that evening, the house grew quieter. Margaret tried to distract herself with tasks, books, and small projects. But her mind kept wandering back to Thomas's refusal. She wondered if she had pushed too hard by simply asking. She thought about the ways she could demonstrate the importance of the custom without making him feel pressured. Notes, stories, small gestures. She considered every possibility, knowing that patience might be the only path forward. Yet even with her resolve to wait, Margaret couldn't ignore the gentle pull in her heart. The custom she longed to share wasn't merely an activity. It was part of her soul, a way she expressed love, memories, and hope. She believed that one day Thomas might understand, and she wanted to keep that possibility alive without breaking his trust. She realized that balancing desire and respect required careful steps, honesty, patience. One night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the window and watched the rain fall. The street lights reflected off wet pavements, shimmering softly. She thought about the boy she had adopted, the young man he was becoming, the invisible thread that still connected them. It was delicate, but it was there. She knew she couldn't abandon it. She had to trust that love, genuine, patient, and respectful love, could bridge the distance between them. Even though Thomas had refused, Margaret felt a quiet determination rising within her. She wasn't going to force him. She would wait, watch, show through her actions why this custom mattered. She knew it would take time, and perhaps courage on both sides, but she felt strongly that following her heart, even in the face of rejection, was the right thing to do. Sometimes love required risk, the risk of disappointment, the risk of misunderstanding, but it also offered the possibility of deeper connection, understanding, and shared joy, too. As the rain continued to fall and the house settled into quiet, Margaret whispered a soft promise to herself. She would honor Thomas's choice, but she wouldn't hide her heart. She would be patient, gentle, honest. She would do what felt right, and perhaps one day he would join her willingly. For now, she had hope, and hope was enough to keep her moving forward. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light into the kitchen. Margaret brewed another pot of tea and placed a cup beside Thomas's plate. She didn't mention the custom. She didn't ask him again, at least not yet. But in her heart, she carried the quiet certainty that love, patience, and persistence might one day create the connection she longed for. Though the distance still lingered, she could feel the fragile threads of trust and affection between them, ready to be strengthened when the time was right. Margaret woke the next morning with a heavy heart, yet a quiet determination. She knew she couldn't force Thomas to participate in the custom she cherished, but she could find ways to demonstrate why it mattered to her. She decided to begin with small, gentle gestures. Every day she left tiny notes for him, on the table, in his books, tucked into his backpack, carefully worded to express her feelings without pressure. Each note was brief, honest, heartfelt. "I hope one day you'll understand why this matters to me. I won't push, but I hope you'll see my heart." Thomas would find the notes, read them quietly, place them back where he found them. He never replied, but Margaret noticed the way he sometimes glanced at her with a faint, conflicted smile, a mixture of curiosity and resistance. Days passed and Margaret continued her quiet efforts. She invited him into conversations, sharing stories from her past, talking about the custom in a way that made it feel natural rather than forced. Sometimes she recounted her own childhood memories, the moments of joy, the small celebrations, the warmth she had felt in those times. Thomas listened politely, occasionally asking questions, but always keeping a careful distance. Margaret knew she had to respect it, yet the distance pained her. She longed for him to feel what she felt, to understand why this custom was more than an activity. It was a piece of her soul she wanted to share. One evening, Margaret found Thomas sitting by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden. The evening light fell softly across his face, highlighting the tension and hesitation in his eyes. She approached quietly, careful not to startle him, and sat on the floor beside him. The air between them was calm but charged, filled with unspoken words and lingering emotions. "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Margaret began softly. I want to share something important with you, something I've carried in my heart for a long time." Thomas didn't speak immediately. He stared at the droplets of rain racing down the glass, his thoughts hidden but heavy. Finally, he whispered, "Margaret, I respect you. I really do. But I can't. I'm not ready. I don't know if I ever will be." Margaret's chest tightened, but she forced a small, understanding smile. She reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "I know, Thomas, and I promise I will never force you. I only hope, in time, you might see why this means so much to me." He looked at her, eyes wide with emotion he couldn't quite name. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The rain, the soft light, the quiet hum of the house. Thomas could feel the honesty in her words, the strength in her gentle persistence. He didn't agree. He didn't have to. But there was something in Margaret's sincerity that made him pause. He realized that even in refusal, love could be expressed. And even in resistance, trust could survive. Margaret continued her quiet efforts over the following weeks. She found ways to make the house feel warm and inviting, creating spaces where Thomas could observe the custom without pressure. Sometimes she would leave small reminders of it around the home. A book, a handwritten note, a melody she loved. She wanted him to see it as a living part of her life, not a demand. Every gesture was carefully measured, thoughtful, filled with love. Thomas began noticing these things. He saw how she lit candles in the evening, how she prepared her favorite tea, how she hummed softly while arranging little details around the house. He started feeling a pull, subtle but undeniable, curiosity about why she did these things, a longing to understand her heart. Margaret didn't push. She only allowed her life to be visible, hoping he would choose to step closer on his own. One afternoon, Margaret invited Thomas to join her in the garden. The air was fresh after the rain and the flowers glistened with droplets. She suggested nothing, simply sat beside him and shared stories of her childhood. She spoke of celebrations, of small joys, of times when sharing with family had made life brighter. Thomas listened, captivated by her voice and the gentle way she wove her memories together. He felt a warmth he couldn't explain, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. "You know," Margaret said quietly, "I don't need you to do anything you don't want to. I hope someday you might see why this matters. And if not, that's okay too. I just want you to know my heart." Thomas looked at her, studying her face, and something shifted. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, not a clear decision, but a softening. He realized that Margaret's insistence wasn't about control or demand. It was about sharing, openness, trust, and in that realization, he felt a strange comfort. Even if he resisted, the bond between them was still strong, still alive, still precious. That evening, Thomas went to his room. Margaret sat by the window again. She reflected on the weeks that had passed, the notes, the stories, the small gestures. She knew that persistence without pressure was delicate, a tightrope of emotions. She had to tread carefully. Her love for Thomas was deep, fierce, patient. She knew it had to be expressed with respect for his choices. Yet a quiet hope grew in her heart, the belief that one day he might join her willingly, moved by understanding rather than obligation. A week later, Thomas approached her in the kitchen while she was preparing tea. He didn't say much at first, only stood there looking uncertain. Margaret smiled gently, waiting, giving him space to speak. Finally, he said, "Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said. I still don't know if I'm ready, but I do want to understand why it matters so much to you." Her heart lifted. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't participation. It was curiosity, a willingness to see into her heart. That small step, however fragile, meant everything. Margaret reached out and took his hand gently but firmly, letting him know that she valued this small moment as much as she would have full acceptance. "That's all I ask," she said. "Just understanding. Just seeing what I feel. The rest will come in its own time." They spent that evening in quiet conversation. She didn't insist. She didn't explain everything. She only shared little pieces of her world, letting Thomas ask questions if he wanted. And he did, softly, hesitantly, but genuinely. Each question, each response was a thread weaving them closer together. Margaret felt the bond between them strengthen, fragile but alive, built on trust and mutual respect. She understood that this journey wasn't about forcing change. It was about creating space for connection, allowing Thomas to see her heart without fear, without pressure, without expectation. It was about patience, hope, gentle persistence. And though the future was uncertain, Margaret felt a quiet confidence that their bond could survive any hesitation, any refusal, because it was rooted in honesty, care, and love. Margaret woke that morning with a blend of hope and anxiety. The weeks of gentle persistence had brought small progress, Thomas's willingness to listen, to ask questions, to notice her small gestures, but she knew the final step would be the most delicate. It wasn't enough for him to understand in fragments. She wanted him to feel the depth of her heart, to realize that her insistence was not about control but about love, connection, and shared experience. She prepared herself for the day carefully, deciding to focus on honesty and openness above all. She found Thomas in the garden, as usual, observing the flowers glistening with dew. The morning sun cast a golden light over everything, and the air was crisp with the scent of earth and grass. Margaret approached slowly, careful not to startle him, and sat on the stone bench beside him. There was silence at first, heavy with anticipation, but not uncomfortable, just the weight of unspoken feelings. "Thomas," she began gently, "I know you've been thinking about what I said. I know it hasn't been easy for you to understand why this matters to me. I want you to know something. I won't force you. I will never force you. But I also can't ignore what I feel in my heart." Thomas turned his head slightly, studying her. There was hesitation in his eyes, but also curiosity. He had watched her act with patience and respect, and he realized that her persistence was not about pressuring him. It was about being honest with herself, about sharing a piece of her soul with him. He shifted slightly, unsure how to respond, yet he didn't look away. Margaret continued, her voice steady but soft. I've spent so many years wanting to connect with you in ways that feel meaningful to both of us. I know it's not your choice yet, and that's okay. But I need to follow what feels right to me. I need to share this part of myself with you, even if it takes time for you to understand. Thomas listened quietly. He felt a strange pull, a blend of respect, admiration, and something warmer, gentler that he hadn't recognized before. Margaret's words were honest and vulnerable, not demanding or insistent. She wasn't asking him to agree immediately. She was simply being true to herself. And in doing so, she made it possible for him to see the love and care behind every gesture, every note, every quiet effort over the past weeks. I still don't know if I can do what you want, Thomas said finally, his voice low, hesitant. But I want to try to understand. I want to see why this matters so much to you. Her heart lifted at those words. It wasn't full agreement, but it was a step. A fragile, tentative step that showed trust and willingness. Margaret reached out and took his hand gently but firmly, letting him know that she valued this small moment as much as she would have complete acceptance. That's all I ask, she said. Just understanding, just seeing what I feel. The rest will come in its own time. They spent the morning together, quietly walking among the flowers, talking about life, dreams, the little moments that shaped them. Margaret shared more stories of her past, memories filled with laughter and light. Stories that explained the custom without making it feel like an obligation. Thomas listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply observing. The tension that had lingered between them softened with every word, every gentle laugh, every small exchange. By afternoon, Margaret suggested a simple activity connected to the custom. Nothing overwhelming, nothing demanding, just a shared moment in the sunlight. Thomas hesitated but agreed, moving slowly, cautiously, yet with an openness he hadn't shown before. As they worked together, Margaret noticed the way his expression softened, the way he began to enjoy the quiet companionship without feeling forced. She realized that love and understanding couldn't be rushed. They had to be allowed to grow naturally, nurtured with care, patience, sincerity. During a quiet pause, Thomas looked at her and said, I think I understand a little more now. It's not just a custom for you. It's part of who you are. It's why you've been so gentle, so patient all these weeks. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. Yes, Thomas, it's part of me. And I wanted to share it with you because you matter to me more than I can ever explain. Not because I want to change you, but because I want you to know my heart. Thomas nodded slowly. There was a softness in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of her feelings. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't ready to embrace everything fully, but he felt closer to her than ever. For the first time in weeks, he realized that her insistence had not been about control. It had been about connection, honesty, the courage to follow one's heart without fear of rejection. That evening they returned to the house. Tired but peaceful, Margaret prepared tea and they sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing the warmth of the day, the comfort of quiet companionship. Margaret felt a weight lift from her heart. She hadn't forced Thomas. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply been true to herself. And in that truth, she had created space for him to come closer on his own terms. Over the following days, the bond between them grew stronger. Thomas began to observe more, notice small gestures, even ask questions without prompting. Margaret responded with warmth, never pressuring, only sharing pieces of her heart. Little by little, the distance that had once seemed unbridgeable began to disappear, replaced by trust, understanding, and a sense of shared experience. One evening, Thomas approached her while she arranged flowers in the living room. He looked uncertain, but there was calm in his voice. Margaret, I'm not completely ready yet, but I think I want to try. I want to be part of this, in my own way. Margaret's heart swelled. She didn't need more than that. She reached out and embraced him gently, careful to respect his space, letting him know that his willingness was enough. The room felt warm, alive with unspoken love, understanding, the promise of more shared moments in the future. She realized then that love wasn't about immediate acceptance or grand gestures. It was about honesty, patience, vulnerability, the courage to follow your heart while respecting the hearts of others. She had insisted, not in force, but in quiet persistence, on doing what felt right to her. And in doing so, she had shown Thomas that love could be gentle, patient, and brave all at once. As night fell and the house grew quiet, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the stars. Thomas was nearby, reading quietly, and she felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey was far from over, but the fragile bond of understanding they had rebuilt was stronger than ever. She knew that more challenges would come, more hesitation, more questions. But she was ready. She would continue to be honest, patient, true to herself, trusting that love, when expressed with care and respect, could overcome doubt and fear. And as the stars glittered above and the house settled into comfortable silence, Margaret understood that some connections required time, courage, and unwavering faith. She had followed her heart, and in doing so, she had created space for Thomas to find his way back to her, not through force, but through love. If this story touched something inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this remind us that patience and honesty can bridge even the widest distances. Thank you for being here.